So I'm Charu and I am from Tata Institute of Social Sciences from the School of Media and Cultural Studies. And we will be beginning today's panel on gender and the city. So before any further delay, I'll invite Isheeta Sharma from Dr. B.R. Ambedkar University to please share her paper with us. Please share your work with us and we'll be very happy. We'll go ahead from there.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Isheeta, and I am from Dr. B.R. Ambedkar University, Delhi. Today, I'm presenting my paper titled Navigating Dark Streets, City and Sex Work in Chameli. Cinema has been a tool of archiving the city in its multiple forms. The emergence of contemporary processes of urban sanitization have been paralleled in their cinematic makeup, leading to clean, gentrified images and bodies. The body of the sex worker in Hindi cinema has been a crucial site of reiterating and reworking these boundaries. This paper looks at this archive of the city through an intersectional lens in the depiction of sex workers and their interactions with the urban space in the 2003 film Chameli. The dark street of Mumbai, where the movie unfolds, is what Ranjini Mazumdar calls a, quote, symbolic organizer of a set of contradictory impulses that generates intense performances. In Chameli, the performances of pain, of trauma, of friendship and love, of violence on the street are tied in intricately with global conversations around sex work and agency. The debates between abolitionist and anti-abolitionist arguments on sex work, which blur the line between choice, violence, human trafficking, and sexual commerce, are crucial frameworks through which the identity of Chameli and her negotiations with the city might be understood. Her interactions with Aman, the righteous upper caste man, with the police, with the procurer, with the clients and other sex workers are all performances of her identity which simultaneously shape and are shaped by the public space she occupies. Examining sexual commerce as being produced on a continuum, Swati Shah looks at the street as a site of regulation constituted by a range of practices. However, even as the street is a space of regulation in Chameli, it is also a continuum of contestations, looping in discourses on identity, power, and spatial networks. Sex work and the city have had a long-founded intricate connection, especially in the way that areas where sex work is sought become the other of the city within the city. Sonagachi, GB Road, and Kamatipura are some famous examples of red light districts in India, which invoke a certain sense of depravity and dread in the popular imagination. But as Shah points out, it is not just within the space of the brothel that sex workers operate in a city, but also at urban street corners, labor markets, or other market areas. While most urban spaces seem to be created for one particular purpose, a look at how spaces can mean multiple things and can actually interact with each other to create meanings is crucial in understanding the enmeshing of sex work and the city. The regulation of spaces of sex work has been important to the codification of model citizens, ideal men and women, from the modern colonial cityscape period to now. Phil Hubbard's work on prostitution, drawing from David Sibley's work, shows how spatial exclusion plays an important role in creating and maintaining distinctions of otherness. Mary Lang and Ian R. Cook point out that within the city, sex work is both included and excluded. While in some city spaces, aspects of sexual commerce find legitimate space, such as bar or lap dancing in five-star hotel clubs, other aspects such as street-side solicitation is constructed as a problem. The task of maintaining these segregations usually lie on the state through institutions such as law and police. These institutions decide what is public, how it can be used, and who might use it, all questions which are both social and political. However, these definitions are also challenged by the continued usage of public spaces, such as the street, outside of the immediate use value. In the vein of David Bell and John Binney's questions on the relationship between sexual citizens and the city, if the city is the space wherein sex work is practiced and performed, how does this performance shape its urban environment? This paper explores questions such as this through the Hindi film Chameli. I argue that Chameli acknowledges a marked shift in the post-globalization discourse on sexuality, labor, and the city space. For the most part, the narrative of Chameli unfolds on a Mumbai street at night, occasionally taking us to other spaces such as the hospital, the police station, among a few others. But even before we realize the visual importance of the street in the film, we are made privy to the threat of the street at night, where the upper caste male protagonist, Aman Kapoor, lost his pregnant wife in a car accident. Unlike many previous Hindi films based on or around sex work, Chameli moves out of the space of the brothel and into the street, bursting forth into an urban milieu of sexual commerce, lesser known to the popular imagination. And in locating Chameli and her work on the streets of Mumbai, the film puts forth a crucial question that starts off the next section. To whom does the street belong? Or in other words, who lays claim to the street? Aman's upper caste character in Chameli is displaced by the sheer act of getting stuck on the streets. On the other hand, Chameli, Hasina, transgender sex worker, her procurer, lovers, police officers, all partake in the drama of the street. Laying claim to a space is also a display of agency, a term that lies at the very crux of the transnational debate between abolitionists and anti-abolitionists on sex work. It has also been a term that has played a significant role in Hindi films on sex work. Who is the prostitute? Does she have agency? As a victim of human trafficking forced into the profession, the sex worker is imagined as powerless, in need of being saved. Such a popular portrayal legitimizes raid and rescue operations, many times funded by social work organizations from the global north in the global south, without taking into account sex work as a part of the informal labor market. In their 2013 study, Rohini Sani and V. Kalyan Shankar surveyed 3,000 sex workers in 14 states to find that many of these women had had prior work experience within the informal sector, and many still continue to engage in other forms of informal labor, making sex work one kind of work they took up for economic reasons. This ties in with Shah's study of sex work solicitation at construction nakas in Mumbai, where migrant women worked as construction workers and sex workers, both economic ways of navigating through life. The invisibilization of the many subjectivities that a sex worker occupies limits the discourse between legitimate/illegitimate and moral/amoral. Historically, the moral disapproval of sex work has been designed to suppress structural coordinates and separate it from labor. The image of the sex worker continues to stay within this moral/amoral discourse, charted across the geography of the urban city. In Chameli, the question of whether sex work is a choice or a compulsion is dismissed when Chameli tells many different versions of the sad stories that led her to sex work. As Aman reacts with compassion and dread, she laughs them off, telling him she gets paid more when she uses these stories. The quote-unquote origin story of a sex worker, which has been the foundational part of most Hindi films on sex work, is never properly addressed in Chameli, denying us as viewers the satisfaction of deciding whether we sympathize with the victimized sex worker or denounce her sexuality. Instead, we are propelled into looking at the conditions that make sex work violent, conditions which make us, the state, the police, law, all complicit. It is also perhaps impossible to talk about the street without the violence of it, especially when private desires are solicited in public. It is not just violence by clients in the form of harassment, lack of measures taken to ensure sexual health, or violence by pimps and madams, but also violence of state institutions such as the police. Police violence and harassment of sex workers is justified by using the logic of safety. To keep the streets of a city safe, sanitized for a middle-class sensibility, sex workers and their clients need to be removed or need to pay for the stay in the form of bribes. The policing of sex work on the street, as Shah points out, is a process of its invisibilization and eventual eradication in order to make the street a morally accepted, safe part of the cityscape. As we see in the film, Chameli is able to negotiate with the police officers, having had such regulations be an everyday part of her street life. On the other hand, Aman struggles with such a negotiation, asking the officer to respect the woman, to which the officer angrily responds to not teach him manners, when Aman is the one hanging out with a quote-unquote FoR, and the officer is the one who works towards protecting him. Another way in which the city becomes an important element in Chameli's narrative is through an inconspicuous background wall, which reads, "AIDS se bacho," be safe from AIDS. The relationship between venereal diseases and sex work has had a long history of its own. During the colonial period, the impact of venereal diseases on British soldiers made the native women who engaged in sex work dirty and diseased, leading to their strict surveillance and sanitation through acts such as the Cantonment Act of 1864. Similarly, the association of AIDS with sex work and homosexuality has its own long and well-established history. Jan Zita Grover writes, "Prostitutes are taken as embodiments of infectiousness less for their actual risks and rates of infection than for their symbolic and historical status." The conversation in Chameli of clients bringing in bimari, a disease, speaks to this transnational discourse on AIDS and sex work and the concerns raised by sex workers about the stigmatization of sex workers instead of provisions being set up for their health and safety. Rakesh Shukla in his work adds to this by looking at how films like Chameli and Devti have come closer to articulating concerns of sex workers, such as decriminalization of sex work and employing safety and remuneration standards, than previous Hindi films on sex work. Shah's invocation of Henry Lefebvre's theorization of space as a social product and as a means of production and control lays the foundation for this paper's understanding of the street in Chameli. The street as a part of an urban cityscape then is tangled in a historical, social, and temporal process. As its meaning and significance is being produced, it is also producing regulated identity. At the same time, as Lefebvre writes, it escapes in part from those who would make use of it. The social and state forces which engendered this space now see but fail to master it completely. The very agency that has forced spatial reality towards a set of uncontrollable autonomy now strives to run it into the ground, then shackle and enslave it. Cinema has been an archive to the history of the cityscape and the continuities and discontinuities within it. The urban city has had a deep dialogue with both modernity and morality, especially tied in with questions of migration in South Asia. This dialogue has been meticulously recorded through cinema and other visual arts. The real or represented city of cinema is born, according to Mazumdar, at the intersection of mental, physical, and social space, recording and representing a range of urban subjectivities. In Chameli, these subjectivities become crucial to challenge binary representations of good/bad, moral/amoral, legitimate and illegitimate, binaries that take the center stage in the popular discourse over sex work. By using the street at night as a space where Chameli's story unfolds, not only does the film create an alternate archive of sex work outside of the brothel, it brings to the forefront the relationship between labor and the city, between sex work and the city.
Thank you, Ishita. So before we move on, I just want to remind everyone that you can post your questions in the Q&A box for all of the participants. Any question that you have, please add questions in the Q&A box so that we can discuss it later. Now we would like to move on, and I would invite Sanjna Sebastian from Christ University to present her paper.
So my article is titled Counterpoints to Urbanity, an examination of the urban women in Tamari's. So this article basically studies the intricate relationship between urban spaces and female subjectivity through character analysis of the protagonist Sulu and screen time analysis of the theme of confrontations. So as Belshaw and Kennedy in 2002 observed that borrowing theoretical frameworks proposed by Henry Lefebvre and Edward Soja, that image representations of reality may be attributed to a false epistemological precedence over realities of lived space, above all, becomes an important note in my paper because it studies how spaces have the potential to conceal the relations of hegemonic power through structures and social institutions like that of the family. So at the outset itself, I would like to start off by saying that the investigation of visual and textual representations of urban spaces is not merely a study of urban consciousness through their representations. It is also an understanding of the importance of cinematic apparatus and the wide-ranging influence to navigate the myths and the mythic representations of cities and locate the persons that are socially sanctioned to propagate these myths. So essentially, we see urban spaces like Mumbai through men, and they dictate the creation of a mythic image in popular imagination. So the effort of my paper was to basically learn how the urban women, Sulu specifically, access the city and laid a claim to the idea of urbanity. So the narrative is pretty simple in itself. It follows a very straightforward plot. There is a middle-class ambitious woman living in a suburban Mumbai, who wishes to attain social and economic freedom, and she wants to do so by by getting a job. And she is a typical housewife, and the adversity strikes when she tries to reclaim her individuality and freedom because she is restricted to her house. So the resistance comes from two different places. One is from her own self, when she's trying to refrain from being typified into a popular imagination of a housewife. And it comes from her social institution of the family as well, when they are trying to keep her within the threshold of her household. Moving on to the confrontations that arise, there are confrontations which are objections to her job as a night RG. And there is this abstract value of honor that is attached to this job. And she's confronted with accusations of not fulfilling a social role as a mother or wanting to cross the threshold of her home. which then leads to the subplot of where of her son running away from home and retaliating because he's not being able to cope up with the stress at home because of the arguments that take place. And then it leads to the transformation, which is basically she has to negotiate and kind of strike a 50-50 partnership deal with her husband to establish a catering business in the radio station itself, where she can supply the food. So in that way, she is able to retain her job and reclaim her agency and get her individual expression back. So from the initial exposition itself, the audience adds to their pre-existing cultural knowledge about real persons. And in this case, it is the urban women. And at the same time, they draw on media knowledge about narrative structures. So throughout the watching experience, the audience's reception of Sulu's character is continuously transformed, adding to the initial character model. So if you see the pictures that I've added in the slide right now, this is the initial sequence. And you see that she is breaking away from a common group of women. And that's when you know that the story is either a didactic story, or it is talking about all of them, but through Sulu. So the audience is basically, again, adding to the pre-existing cultural knowledge. So the reason for choosing this film was to study urban womanhood. And uh, the reason was to study urban womanhood, and that was done in a twofold manner. Basically, to understand the representation of the newness of the urban women, and also to understand how confrontations are always present in women-centric narratives, and there will be a flow of power through the institution of family specific, which led me to understand the character through Jen Sender's model of the clock of character. And this model allowed me to understand the character within an inner world itself. So the character was analyzed through being a symptom, as an artifact, as a fictional being, and as a symbol. So as a symptom, it's obviously explaining how the analysis and cause of it explains the analysis and cause in the process of communication. It explains the filmmaker's intention and the cultural context within which the character is formed. So to analyze Sulu's character as a symptom would be to understand how she is characterized as a housewife and how the devices and techniques are made to fit within this character. Also, one interesting observation within this part of the analysis was that I could come across her formation as her voice. Uh, sorry, when she took up the role of an RJ, her voice became a character of its own, and it morphed into this character that helped the filmmaker and also the character of Sulu to establish a distinction between a woman's language and a code of conduct, despite her invisibility as a person in the city. And this was again dictated by patriarchal ideals, and any deviation from the norm resulted in Sulu's use of sensuality. Um, um, I'm sorry. Yeah, just a minute. Yeah. So basically, the deviation was restricted to this alter ego, and this use of the other language, wherein she would always use the sexy tone or the sensual tone through the part of her alter ego, and all of the confrontations that arise was due to the presence of this alter ego. Moving on to the artifact, I will speak about the theme of the confrontation a little more in the next slide. As a fictional being, it was interesting to study her position within the constellation of characters, which again revealed a lot more about the social cultural context within which the housewife character is established and how she accesses the city space. And lastly, as a symbol, she became a symbol, especially the character of Sulu became a symbol anchoring the suburban existence of an ambitious woman that is confined into the restrictive domestic. This is basically a model of a screen time analysis that I have mapped in my film, in the film that I've chosen. So the x-axis represents the duration of the film, and the y-axis represents the number of characters engaging in the confrontation. So the term confrontation here is used to understand the arguments between characters that represent different ideologies. So the cause of confrontations with the protagonist within the narrative is either a lack of adherence of tradition and the values of honor, or an excess of individualism promised by the idea of urbanity and her intention to tap into it. So despite living in a suburban space in Mumbai, she's bound by traditional understanding of her social role as a wife or a housewife. Her need for economic independence is correlated to the abstract notions of its association to honor, and this becomes a counterpoint to the idea of urbanity itself. And so this story is basically the character's negotiation with the domestic and urban spaces she inhabits and influences, and how her middle class status influences or is superimposed over the experience of the city. The narrative sees the progress of the character in terms of her outward projection of admiration to becoming the subject of admiration. And although the film describes her husband's struggle, there are multiple subplots wherein, like I mentioned before, her son retaliates, or there is her family retaliating. So all of these sub-narratives are present, but the main sub-narrative of her son retaliating gets aligned with her ambitions and proactiveness to seek a job and her wishes to work beyond the space of the house. Due to this intentional alignment, the confrontations that Sulu has with her family become closely linked to her job as a mother and the alleged neglect that she has towards her primary duty as that of a housewife and completion of a social role, basically. So this signifies the embedded agenda of the film to draw from realist cinematic traditions to represent a holistic understanding of urban womanhood, and the confrontations that arise due to the merging of mutually exclusive spaces of home and the urban space within the typification of a housewife. Therefore, the birth of the new woman in the city is limited to its stereotype and melodramatic genre. In other words, the significance of the symbolic uneasiness of social structures operating within the domestic space perpetuates the traditional understanding of of a respectable job, the social standing of a family, and so on. And all of this is stitched closely with the sort of monolithic identity of an urban woman. Moving on to the space of confrontations, what was interesting to note was that because Sulu was a housewife, characterized as a housewife, the constellation positions of the character and even in the pictures that you see on the slide right now, they kind of explain the network of hierarchies and the functions and values and interactions and communications, similarities and contrasts, attractions and rejections of power and recognition within the family setup as well, within the space of the household and within the gender and respective space of the kitchen as well. So this again would lean towards explaining how when this when the woman is trying to lay a claim to the city and assert her agency and reclaim her agency in a manner of speaking by trying to get a job, she is confronted by confrontations which become an extremely important theme to understand how the family as a unit tries to curb this intention. And with that, these are my differences, and that's the end of the presentation.
Thank you, Sanjana. So I would again remind that please share your questions in the Q&A box. And now I invite Hugo from EHESS Paris to share his paper with us.
My name is Hugo. I am a PhD student in urban geography. My university is in Paris, but I'm actually based in New Delhi at the CSH Research Center. So I want to start my presentation with an anecdote, which was shared by Arundhati Roy in a recent interview, in which she narrates that the first time she came to Delhi, she grew up in Kerala, but the first time she came to Delhi as a teenager, she was absolutely terrified by the city. In fact, she was so scared that she was holding a knife in her hand when she was in the street. So the question is, why was she so scared? The reason is cinema. In this interview, she explains that at this time she was watching a lot of Malayalam movies, which were featuring many scenes of rape happening in the city spaces. So in her imagination, big cities was linked to rape, and she was just basically getting ready for this to happen. So it shows the power of cinema in producing space. I heard that before. Isheeta Sharma before me talked about Henri Lefebvre, and this is exactly that. Because cinema does not only create space on the screen, cinema also impacts, colors, our own experience of space around us. So traditionally, especially in the 70s and 80s, even the 90s, Hindi cinema has portrayed the city as a threat for women. It was either a space where women had too much freedom, which was leading to depravity, or it was a space which was full of risks and which was generating vulnerability for women. In both scenarios, the presence of women in the urban space was questionable and indeed questioned. However, as far as the question of the presence of women in the urban space is concerned, there has been a strong change of tone in the last decade. Elizabeth Wilson, who is a geographer, was one of the first to say that, wait a second, city is not only about danger, city is not only about violence. city can also be a place of emancipation for both men and women. And of course, in the context of India, you have now the classic book Why Loiter by Shilpa Pharte, Shilpa Ranade, and Samira Khan, which claim the right of women to loiter in the city, to take risks in the city, and to bear the fruits of the city. So 1 year after the release of this book, there was another turning point, which was the Nirbhaya agitation, the demonstration which followed the notorious gang rape in Delhi. And here it's interesting because for the first time you had women who were not only asking for more safety in the streets, but they were asking bluntly for freedom. So we had a dialectical shift from a focus on suraksha and izzat, safety, respect, to a greater focus on azadi and maza, freedom, fun. And this is very important. And we see that following all these turning points, we had a tremendous amount of women-led movements in India and even in Pakistan, in fact, to claim greater access to the urban space. So it is in this context that I have carried out this study. I wanted to understand that in the last decade, where we have seen so many changes, how has Hindi cinema depicted the engagement of men and women with the urban space? So in other words, what I wanted to do initially was I wanted to measure how much male and female characters get to loiter in Hindi films. And to do that, I decided to adopt a quantitative approach to be able to identify patterns in movies. So this study was, to some extent, we can say, also a methodological experiment. So what I did, the protocol which I followed, is that I've not studied a movie as a whole. I selected a few movies and I measured, mapped scene per scene. For example, in each scene, I looked who are the characters present, where is the action taking place, what kind of action is taking place. And this gave me a data set where the volume of images that we digest as an audience was basically measured. So in terms of sampling, I studied 10 different movies. So you might think it's not a lot for a quantitative study. Actually, it is a lot because, again, I have studied each scene of this movie, which is a lot. It's about 900 scenes, which is equivalent to more than 6,000 data points. In terms of selection criteria, I wanted movies where women at the center of the storyline. And the reason being is that I wanted to see that when woman is given enough space to express herself in the script, how does she interact with the city? All the movies were shot in cities, different types of cities. We have movies shot in Mumbai, movies shot in Delhi, and also a few smaller cities. And all of them released in the last decade. I also try to have a kind of balance in my sample in terms of age group. It's not difficult because in Hindi cinema there is a big disbalance in that matter, but I did make some efforts. Also in terms of socioeconomical status, and even in terms of type of production. So you have big blockbusters like Bam Baja Bharat. You also have more art house kind of movie like Sir. You have OTT release movies like Ahoni, and you even have one TV series, Little Things. What does this data tell us? What did I find out? Well, first of all, clearly, the female characters in this movie spend less time in the public space, less time in the streets than the male protagonists. On average, men spend 1.5 more time in the streets than women. And if we look at specifically at scenes shot in the streets, in public spaces, we find that men are almost twice more visible than women in terms of screen time. More specifically, when we look at what kind of activities men and women indulge in when they're in the streets, we observe that women tend to be involved in what I call serious activities. So it can be work. So for example, if we talk about the paper by Isheeta before, in Chaneli, well, she's in the street most of the time, but she's working. So work, transportation, or utilitarian activities, like for example, fetching kids from school or buying groceries. By contrast, men are more often involved in some kind of lighter activities. So for example, they are having fun, like eating snacks in the street, or they do nothing whatsoever, like just sitting on a bench or walking aimlessly with friends. So of course, this resonates with the book Why We Loiter, which I mentioned before, which tells us that women often have to display some kind of purpose when they access the street. Similarly, if we look at fun, the scenes where women and men are having fun, women tend to have fun at home in the private space, while men tend to have fun in the streets, in the public space. Also, what is interesting is that we observe that when they are in the street, women tend to be much more mobile than men. You can see that men, 60% of their screen time in the street, they have no movement whatsoever. Again, it is in line with what we can read in the white letter, which is that women have to perform some kind of purpose, and being in movement is a way to do that. You can also observe very interestingly that women tend to walk much more than men, and also they tend to use public transportation in orange more than men. This is also interesting because this is fully in line with the literature on mobility in urban India. Because women have lesser access to resources and private vehicles, they tend to walk and use buses or trains more than men. Finally, an interesting observation is that when they are in the streets, women spend very little time only with other women. By contrast, men spend 7 times more with male friends or male mates in general. Why? How to explain that? I see two possibilities. One is that often women need a male guardian to access the street as a way to legitimize their presence in the public space. But also, I think more crucially here, we are facing an issue of blind spots in Hindi cinema, or in all cinemas actually, in terms of female friendships, which is often very invisible in movies. In fact, out of the 10 movies of my sample, we know the name of the female friend of the main protagonist in only 4 of them. So I'm going to conclude. We can see that in all these movies, women engage with the urban space with much more restraint than men. So now the next question, of course, is why does it matter? Like, does it send a negative signal in terms of presence of women in the public space? I want to argue the exact opposite. In fact, what I see is that in all these 10 movies, the city is portrayed in a rather positive light. The city is definitely not the enemy, like it was often the case in the previous decades. In fact, the city brings jobs, the city sometimes brings love, unexpected encounters, social transgression sometimes even, and new perspectives in life. Yet, this positive portrayal of the city is not a naive one. As the data shows, the movies also display very clearly the inequalities that men and women are facing when accessing the urban space. Some movies do portray cases of harassment, but this is never at the center of the storyline. And we don't have vivid cases of rape like we could have seen in previous movies. So overall, my impression is that the relative realism of these movies makes the engagement of women with the urban space somehow relatable and therefore inspiring. And so, collectively, I find that these movies do convey the idea that women, like men, can truly thrive from their interaction with the urban space. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hugo. That was a wonderful insight into the presentations. Now I would request Saim Raza to please share your comment.
Gender and gender spaces, the effect and counter-effect between gender and urban city, which Hugo was already pointing out, and I'm glad to take it ahead from here, way left. So, spaces have already been discussed, but point here that in the drama itself and even in the textual form of narrative, the stage is a space in which the narrative was grounded, takes an important role in moving the destiny of the character. So in Hardy's novel, in The Return of the Native, we see similar cases with Heath. Also in Batman, we see the similar case with Gotham. And N2 has clearly observed this space is not gender neutral. On the contrary, it can be said that all spaces are gendered spaces. And this was with regards to the gender of space. And with regards to the specific of gender, now space plays an important role in affecting the sexuality of a character and how sexual interactions take place within a space. Judith Butler has popularly noted that the performance of drag plays a distinction between the anatomy of the performer and the gender that is being performed. So this implies that the gender of a participant in the space is significantly challenged and distorted by spaces because it imposes certain performance on a person. And with regards to the research gap that is in this area, much of the work on space gender has been done as to how organizational spaces affect the women in particular while working in popular spaces. And only a few researchers have linked it back to the stage, the screen, or even text. So for this particular research, I focused on life in a metro as my case study for this particular research. And the instances of gendering in the spaces has been noted. And I've taken it from the organizational spaces researchers as well. And that the office of a conglomerate, or the office of the corporate office and the managerial section and the space is actually a very masculine space. It has glass walls, you can look through, it has a panopticon positioning, it has a panopticon structure, which can breach everyone's privacy. So they know what is happening in the cubicle. And there is no sense of privacy left with the individuals who are working in the corporate space. As the person of his sexual expression. And this limitizes the extent to which a person can express himself or herself as his or her or their own identity. So we see that Ranveer has glass walls all around his managerial office. And also when Rahul gets promoted, the promotion is signified by moving from the cubicle to a glass walled chamber. So the cubicle is symbolized as a location of powerlessness, while the office in the panopticon position is signified as the powerful and the powering and towering structure of power. And also we see that this is a very masculine understanding of space where there is no privacy of other individuals taken into account. Now, what we see in another office that is of Shruti's boss's office, that he has a treadmill in the office. Now, the purpose of the treadmill in the office is actually to hide his sexuality, and which is, of course, his orientation of being a gay, and to assert that he is equally masculine as the other characters in the office. So the treadmill is not actually an expression of his masculinity, rather a trope or a prop to hide his real identity. So the office actually is a masculine space, and it is reasserted that it is a masculine space, and the character which enters into it must act like that. Also, we see that in the old age home, the room of Shivani, the elderly lady who falls in love with Amol and is waiting her lover to return from America, and when he returns, she starts with him in her own room. So the room in the old age home has surprisingly a kitchen involved in the room, which is entirely not needed because old age homes have a provision of providing meals. So the kitchen is inside the premises of the room, and also to assert more femininity and or to assert more of this feminine identity of her space, of the space of her room in particular. There's also a mixer grinder placed just beside her bed near the window from where she looks out, which is entirely a decorative piece, an addition to assert that the female space is the feminine space, or that because she has that agency to her room and because romantic scenes have to take place in that room, the space is given a feminine identity. And also twice in the movie there is a reference to the ladies compartment of the local train. So the first reference is when Akash and Shikha are meeting on the railway station and they are planning to go back to their respective places. And Shikha says that she travels in the ladies compartment, and Akash says that we can perhaps travel together. So she says that we cannot travel in the ladies compartment. And the second reference to the ladies compartment is towards the end of the movie when Monty is chasing behind Shruti and Shruti gets into the ladies compartment. Monty also gets into the ladies compartment. So this ladies and this again the female space again plays a certain role in this particular movie as we will see it later. And the flat culture, of course, in the metropolitan also has been very instrumental in the movie. So we see that the flats of unmarried working individuals all appear alike, regardless of gender or sexual connotators or signifiers. And it signifies that there has been a carrying over of the office environment to the residence. And since the professional environment is masculine, the flats do appear like that. This was with regards to the gender space. Now, as we move ahead and we come to spacing of gender. On the professional space, Ranjit's masculinity reaches its zenith. It is from his own office that he calls and refuses Shikha about the anniversary, and he forgets the anniversary in the office. And of course, it is in the office that he demands the key to Rahul's flat, and it is the site of torment and torture of Rahul and Neha alike. And Neha becomes a sufferer because she has to rely on Ranjit for promotions and incentives. And so, professional setting, only in his own house that he can really express his own gender and his own sexuality. Now, the flats are spaces of toxic masculinity, which makes females suffer. So, Neha, we come to know that Neha commits suicide in Rahul's flat because she cannot endure the treatment that is being given to her by Ranjit. And in fact, she tries to speak out against it, but she is not successful because the space is a toxic masculine space. And even Rahul becomes a victim of this toxic masculinity because he does not purchase this idea of a male being a toxic male, and which stems from the linkage between his private and the professional space. And the feminine nature of Shikha and Ranjit's house, because they are a married couple, promotes female authority and gives Shikha the power to cross do in Rahul's flat. Also, the female compartment of the local train disallows Akash indirectly but allows Monty to gain access to it to claim the real love which he has for Shruti. And this taming of the male temper can be observed in the female spaces. Also, we see that the space of Rahul's flat, which is masculine and toxically masculine, does punish Neha to the extent that she commits suicide. But when Shikha commits a mistake of going outside the rules and regulations of marriage, the space does not punish Shikha directly. Rather, the space forces a fever on the daughter of Shikha and Ranjit, and because of the fever, because of the sickness of the daughter, Shikha has to stay back and she comes back into the boundaries of marriage. The female space acts as a friend, as a guide, and as a consoler in times of crisis with other female members of the space. And with regards to public spaces, government offices, roads, and railway stations, these act as mediators between the private and the professional spaces. So they help fix the rifts and cracks in relationships and act as equalizers. So this is the transition from the professional to the private. So on the transitioning from the professional to the private, the power structures are also changing. So on the road, everybody is equal. In public spaces, everybody is given an equal opportunity to assert her or his identity and her or his interest. So we see towards the end of the movie that it is on the road that Shruti goes and confesses to Monty that she actually loves him. And then Monty chases behind Shruti, trying to stop her from going away. And then, of course, we also say that Neha suddenly gets this power to confront Ranjit, and she moves out of the car and gets behind chasing Rahul to stop him from escaping from the city. And also, it is on the road that Shikha gets this power. It is on the railway station, in fact, that Shikha gets the power to negate Akash and tell him in plain words that she cannot dissolve her marriage for him. And it is also on the road that Shivani's last wish of dying with Amol is fulfilled. So the road gives an equal opportunity to everyone to stress their identities, to stress their interests and sexual orientations. And with regards to conclusion and how it is all related to urbanicity, we see that the urban multinational metropolitan sphere of the city somewhere or the other creeps into every other city. And as has also been noted by Mazumdar in his seminal work Bombay Cinema and Archive of the City, the new landscape of the urban spaces resulting from the expansion of industrial capitalism not only shaped the transition of a modern way of being in the world, but was also impacted by the culture of the moderns. We see that the culture which Monty carries is initially disregarded by Shruti because she's sitting in a cafe which is the replica and a simulacra of the cafe of America and France. And the custom and the way of living that Monty expresses inside the cafe is very rural and rustic. So she, in the beginning, denies his validity and the validity of expression that Monty makes. But towards the end of it, we see that the culture of moderns is affecting and counteracting with the urban setting, with the metropolitan, and it is also making its space bit by bit. So we also see that the urban setting penetrates the lives of all characters, and we see the flats of working ladies being featureless and added on with a library as a representative of the life of the metropolis, where the purpose of living is occupation and earning, and not love and romance. Even the house in which Shikha and Ranjit lived, they had to pay on EMI, as Shikha tells Akash in one of their meetings. And the stress of having worked during the prime of their youth to repay the EMI makes them act like business partners rather than life partners. And Neha and Rahul's relationship also remains distraught and unattainable largely because of the corporate working structures. The office does give them promotion, but it snatches their sexual aspirations from them. It is only after detaching themselves from the official setting, which is Rahul's resignation towards the end of the movie, and its owner, which is Neha's abandoning of Ranjit on the road, also towards the end of the movie, that their aspirations can be fulfilled. However, that does also imply that both of them have become unemployed and are destined to search for a job at other places. So the urban space therefore intervenes in sexual aspirations of the participants and forces them to alter and fit in the majorly patriarchal framework, as most offices are headed by the males. But these patriarchal males appear vulnerable in the private spaces like houses, which act as feminine spaces, or even in case of Shruti's boss, as sexual spaces. So we see that towards the end of the movie, all the crisis that has been spread from the professional spaces is solved towards the end, towards the private, and we see in this solution coming out from the public space an assertion on the socialist identity of the Indian masses. And we see that the major problems that are occurring from the corporate structure, and the solutions that are arising at socialist spaces. And this also tells that the traditional family structure, and it is also a narrative and a discourse on the support of traditional family structures in a socialist setting. And we see that corporate or the metropolitan life as in itself fragmentary and anti institution of marriage, because we see that marriages are distraught and relationships are distraught because of the corporate setting of the metropolitan. So the metropolitan acts as and interacts with the sexuality and gender of the participants through the corporate structure, which is resolved either by the private space, which is the female space, or through the public space, which is actually a socialist and an equalizing factor towards the end of the movie. And that would be all. Thank you.
Thank you, Saim. Thank you all the panelists for sharing such insightful papers. We will begin with a question and answer round now. Before we move to the questions in the chat box, one of the questions that I have for Ishita is how do you think that when an analyst or when a filmmaker comes from a specific class, so do you think like the class that a person comes from who's representing an image or creating an image uh, on the screen, or the class of an analyst who's analyzing the lives of sex workers, so how do you think that class plays a role in creation of this image?
Right. Thank you for the question. I think caste and class both play a role in any kind of creation and representation specifically. Um, in terms of just this analysis that I did, I belong to an upper caste, a middle class family, and the creators of the film belong to the same milieu. The actor representing it belongs to a same milieu. So yes, definitely there are ideas, there are representations, there are images that get recreated, which are heavily not just gendered, but also um, caste oriented. So that is something that is unavoidable, and hopefully will be the only hope is that it will be rectified in the future with more not just visual representation, but actual representation in numbers in different areas and aspects. Yeah, I mean, but I do believe that it does impact, and there is no way around it, there's no way to justify it.
So one question that I have here is, it's a general question directed at any of you, that whoever wants to answer. So could you think of how the figure of the city itself appears within the cinematic texts that you have analyzed? So anyone can take up this question.
May I go?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so I had taken the film Tumhari Silo, and basically, um, what I observed from that is that when you understand the urban woman as a character, as opposed to a modern woman who is basically embodying the city, who kind of warns the audience about the perils of modernity, she is very different from the urban woman. And when you take the particular case of Sulu, the city does not even make an appearance in the story in a way, because if you see films like Gobighad, the director Kiran Rao, in one of her interviews, she mentioned that the city was itself a living organism, a fifth character in the story that was very actively influencing all of the protagonists in the story. So, but when you see the character of Sulu being an urban woman, there was no influence whatsoever. You only know she's in a city when she mentions that she is from Virar, a suburb, or when you see her traveling in public transport. And that was a really interesting thing to observe, because even though she is an urban woman and space becomes this primary category in her characterization itself, you see her very restricted to the domestic space. So I think when it comes to women characters, these gendered spaces become more prominent as compared to the public space of this.
That's interesting, actually. So it does appear in some way or the other, but
yeah, and also I think when there is a balance between, if the balance is like one end tradition, one end modernity or urbanity, the tradition part would weigh heavier than urbanity itself. So you would want to, cinema very actively tries to typify this character and keep them within the traditional boundaries.
I guess because like all of you have talked about and brought up the question of city. So would anyone else also like to participate in answering this question?
Maybe if I can just build on what Sanjna just said. So even in the case of Marisulu, I don't completely agree. I agree with you in one part and disagree with you on one part. I think in this very movie, we can see a very strong contrast between where she lives in the suburbs and where she works, which we assume is more central location in Mumbai. And this is reflected also in the architecture. Even I've seen the movie long time ago, but even in what I remember the color, somehow I have memories of like more yellowish colors kind of when she's at home in the suburbs, and more bright colors where she works. So like a contrast between maybe modernity and tradition. But where I really agree with you, to answer the original question, what is striking in many movies is that the city actually does not exist. It's as if it was invisible. So people live in the city, they are urban citizens. But the city as a space, sometimes in many movies, is as if it did not exist. And I am a student in urban geography, and I think it tells a lot about how today people understand the city. Many people actually don't really care about their surrounding. They care about their where they live, where they work, but whatever is in between, somehow it loses in importance. And that's why in many movies, the city does not exist. And I'll give just one example, which is always the one which comes to my mind. It's this TV show, which is called, I think, One More Shot, Please, right? This is I mean, if we talk about the urban space, it's fascinating. These four women live in the city, but we never see Mumbai, or the Mumbai we get to see is a Mumbai that I have never seen. So yes, I fully agree with Sanjana that in many movies the city space is almost invisible, doesn't exist.
Can I just add to what Hugo just said? I mean, the aspect of the city being invisible, and I think in Chameli, what happens is how the city becomes visible is when it breaks down, literally. So it starts on a rainy night, right? It's raining, everything is clogged. Aman's car gets stuck, and that's how the street and the city become very prominent in the movie. So it literally becomes visible when it's not functional anymore. Just yeah.
Let me add on to that. With regards to the visibility of the city and city suddenly becomes visible. With regards to life in a metro, we see it appears in the radio jockey's announcements of the morning. So when the radio jockey actually comes up and says that, tell us about an event of your breakup and how did you feel after your breakup, and that is at a very crucial juncture in the city. And this tells about what narratives goes on even in the radio, even how these distraught relationships are a common thing, and that is why he's asking about this. This tells about how metropolitan actually does not allow these kinds of relationships to hold on very long. There's certain a tradition, a shift towards a metropolitan tradition of sexuality and sexual relationships, and of course orientation. So for me, Mumbai itself is visible in Ranjit's face, and the kind of faces that he makes and the kind of arguments that he puts forward, that I have to earn for the family, and to earn I have to do anything. And even if it is my own anniversary, I have to forget it. I'm doing it because I'm working. And the idea of work itself is very metropolitan and commercial and corporate oriented. And that is how in Ranjit I see that the metropolitan imbibes itself and incarnates itself into Ranjit as the main character.
Okay, so those are very interesting insights actually. And I would actually like to engage more on this question, but because we are a little short of time, so I'll go on to the next one. So Lakshmi ma'am has asked Ishita, uh, you have taken Chameli for your analysis, and this film was taken in recent times in globalizing Mumbai. So how do you juxtapose your analysis to Gangubai Kathiawadi, which depicts Kamathipura during early independence of India?
Right. Thank you for the question again. Well, Gangubai again, so it is based in a brothel area, or Kamathipura, which is not what Chameli is doing. It's moving out of that area. Again, second thing is that it is based loosely on a real person. So again, there is that aspects of what is real, what is not real, and whose story it is. There is the city comes out very prominently in Gangubai as well, and that I think to owe to the set and the way that it has been created and how the colonial city comes into being. And even though it is post-independence, it's still, I do believe it is still very colonial in its setup. And although I think Gangubai has interestingly raised some issues as well about sex work, and specifically decriminalization of sex work. So in that regards, I don't know if I'll juxtapose it, but yes, I do see similarities and dissimilarities in the way that it has happened. Another thing, the way that I have brought in the transnational debate on abolitionists and anti-abolitionists, which is coming from the global north to the global south, is might be a little difficult to place in Gangubai, simply because of the time period and the it being a period film. So yeah.
The next question is actually directed towards Sanjna. So you have made an interesting analysis of Sulu's character using Jen Ida's framework. I was not clear what are the transformative aspects of her character at the end of the film. Where would you place the woman boss that was played by Neha Dhupia in the film vis-a-vis Sulu?
Okay, thank you for the question, ma'am. So there are a couple of things. So firstly, the fact that the transformative character of a aspect of a character was not very clear was because I don't believe she goes through a very apparent transformation at all. As in, when I say that, I mean that she is trying to reclaim her agency. She's trying to get a job and express her individual freedom and access the city in a way. But also at the same time, towards the end, you see her striking the 50-50 partnership deal with her husband, which is again, it's less of a transformation and more of a negotiation in a way to 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 get what she wants, basically. And secondly, where would I place the women boss would be that I think I will not categorize her on the same level as Sulu, as the urban woman who is stuck in a domestic space, I would say, because I don't see her in the film in a domestic space at all. I see her in the office space. But at the same time, I think she's a facilitator in a way who allows Sulu to know what is beyond the domestic space again. And also, there is another interesting thing that comes up when we think about the women boss, that is the idea of admiration. And you see, Vidya Balan as a character, she has played a lot of brilliant female characters in a lot of films. And you see Sulu as a woman in the domestic space, admiring other women, even if it is her neighbors who are airhostesses. She doesn't try to belittle herself or compare them, but she'll just admire them and projects her admiration. And then when she gets a job in the second half of the film, she herself becomes the subject of admiration in a way. So I think the women boss allows her or facilitates her to reach that position of being the subject of admiration itself.
Thank you for that answer, Sanjana. So the next question is actually for Sam. How do you think a house becomes feminine? And in the way of a woman having a hole there, or of the male losing his overt masculinity in the house?
So masculinity always seeks a justification. Masculinity or any source of power, any exercise of power never comes without a justification. So the justification for masculinity is present in the office space. So he can justify his masculinity there with the virtue of his position and his post as the manager of the office. And of course, he rewards obedience and he penalizes disobedience. And this is how he gains the key from Rahul of his flat. But when he comes back to his house, and there is no such contract with his wife apart from their marriage, which of course establishes the wife as an equal sharer of the space. And also in this particular movie and in metropolitan spaces, we are aware that most of the ladies who are wives have actually either they are themselves working ladies or they leave their job after marriage and then become housewives. So there's always this sense that they have sensed and they have tasted the financial freedom and they know what independence feels like and what individual agency is. So this prior being into that environment and being aware of how the corporate functions and how metropolitan spaces reward male power and superiority, it is that through this knowledge and also through the power that the lady has, that she is able to confront the male. So the male of course loses the justification and the lady gains through knowledge and awareness the power to confront the male on that point that he is no longer justified to exercise that kind of oppression or that misuse of power which he could do in the office space because of the contractual power that the corporate has bestowed upon. So this is the loss of justification, which disarms the masculinity of particular person in the private space.
Okay, thank you for that answer, Sam. Um, so the next question is actually directed towards Hugo. Can we see that films where women use more public spaces or equal like the men, do we see that she is shown as running into risk or she is seen as successful? What I want to know is if we can continue to see any patterns now in films of cities as risky, as threatening, or filled with depravity, or as places of fun, freedom, and filled with hope.
Yes, thank you. That's a great question. Um, yes, what I observe is that often the risk does not disappear from the movies. The risk is still there, but I would say the success is somehow more prevalent than the risk. And a good example is the movie Harmony, where you have this group of young women and men as well who come from Northeast and live in Delhi. So actually, in my sample, the female characters of Ahuni are the one who spend the most time in the streets, including doing nothing, just chit-chatting among them. And the reason being that they are not dependent to a family. They are young, unmarried women, and they have enjoy more freedom. And so, yes, they do face risk. There is a case of a harassment at some point in the movie. But I think the overall message of the movie in terms of cityscape is that at the end of the day, they benefit more from the city than they suffer from it. And what do they gain from the city? They gain this incredible network of friends and this freedom, which they might not have back home. So yes, to answer the question, when women use more the public space, it doesn't mean that they are not facing any risk, but they gain a lot out of it. Now, from the second part of the question, I do believe that most of these movies do break with the pattern of the city as threatening. In almost all the movies, we see women having fun in the city. So it, of course, it depends of their familial situation and the kind of city. For example, in Damlogake Haisha, she's a newly married woman. She lives with her in-laws in a small city, Haridwar, I believe, yes. Well, she doesn't have so many opportunities to have fun. But in other movies, for example, in Masan, you can see that one of the girls does find ways to have fun. She ends up with her boyfriend. She goes to a meeting. And I think Little Things, the series, is really the one example of a movie where the female protagonist is seen having fun in the city in several locations. Of course, the reason being that again, she doesn't live with her family; she lives alone with her boyfriend, so she has more opportunities to benefit from the city. But really, um, overall, I do find that these cities break the stereotype of the city. These movies break the stereotype of the city as a threatening space.
So the next question actually here is, does the space of internet also refurbish an idea of a city while being non-spatial in its, like, because it is essentially not a physical space, but does it also like sort of remake an idea of a city?
I think in light of a lot of interesting work being done on materiality of the digital, we might have to question whether it is really a non-physical space at all, because we are looking at, like Yukhui is looking at how data is, the digital data is material and it's an object, it's a thing. So in that way, I do believe the digital and internet are changing aspects, or in some ways reproducing and in some ways changing aspects of the city. And so, I mean, yeah, but I don't think we can make such a clear distinction between physical and non-physical, um, between the digital and the physical city that we can touch. And, so just wanted to point that out.
With regards to this question, it's a very interesting question because we see that the idea of city, even in the movie that I saw, and even the other movies that have been quoted on here, the idea of city is somehow linked with technological advancements. And the technological advancements in itself are visible in its zenith in the internet age. And the internet and multimedia communications, it was in 2007 that Life in a Metro came out. And there was a lot of significant intervention of mobile calls and of messages and of texts and of mails. So we see that somehow or the other, the technological interventions were already being made. And it was through these technological interventions that a person understands what city is. Now, in this particular aspect, in the current understanding, be it a text, be it a novel, be it any other media production, the problem with visibility and representation of internet is that it is not physically representable. So the producer or the writer, what he tries to do is that he tries to portray the effects of the internet on the characters or on the plot. So the internet is very much there, and in fact, to consider it as a city, I believe internet is the whole world, and it is being said that the internet has brought everyone closer, global, and in fact, the metaverse, the idea of metaverse in itself is a digital or a virtual universe in itself. So the idea that internet is just a city is more than that. It is obviously more than that, and the interactions that happen in that metaverse or in that virtual space are or in the digital space are very much real. But the problem with representations on scene or on text will remain because the visibility of this particular interaction is very much problematic. So the representation of the interactions that go on into the digital will be the problem in the upcoming periods, but the interactions are happening and indirectly it is being projected on the screen around.
Okay, so we're very close to the time limit, so I'll just ask the next question. This is from an anonymous attendee. Is city and its people architecture or the services? So it can be all three, but how it comes to effect in the film, as in Badhai, though the city revolves and comes only as a service to hide their secret and represent their struggles with people they know. Ultimately, I am asking, how shall a city come about in a film? Like, is it constituted by people,
Yeah.
architecture, services, and how everything forms the city?
I think if I may, Charu, it's
Yeah.
it's it's definitely all of that and even more than that. And I think that's why the city, the cinematic representation of the city is so fascinating, and we are all discussing that today. It's because it's packed with so many things. And for example, if we take the example of Badaido, no, I don't agree. I think it's more than that. The accent of Ayushmann Khurrana in the movie, which is like full of Punjabi, is very Delhi type. Then you have this kitty party of all these aunties meeting and doing some games in an apartment. Again, very much Delhi middle class. Then you see them in an office, Gurgaon work culture. So you see in one movie, you can give so many hints to reveal the city, to depict the city. And that's why I think we can't summarize how should a city come about. It comes about with all these tiny, sometimes details, but which can matter a lot.
I would also like to add to that. Basically, I would like to time both the questions. That is, I think if you take the idea of internet, this internet refurbishment idea of the city, I would like to go back to Henry Jenkins's idea of media conversions. And I think that when you think about city, I don't know if it city and the idea of city refurbished by the power of internet. I don't know if it's refurbishing it, but I also believe at the same on another end, it's solidifying this mental image about the city. So more than anything, it's solidifying what the idea of a city is and recreating that again and again in mainstream cinema. And to the second question about how shall a city come about in a film, I would like to take some instances from Professor Madhav Prasad's article, Realism and Fantasy in Representations of Metropolitan Life in Indian Cinema. So I'd also cited this in my paper. Basically, what he says is there are two perspectives of the city, and he talks about an external and an internal. So within the internal, there is the basic split between the everyday life and the diversity of the city. And within the external, you see two parts. That is the city as a city of site of attractions, and the second would be site of attractions and then objective imagination. And the second would be its logic of urbanization. So I think um, the moment when we say that this is a city narrative, it itself, we don't need to make it apparent about how it comes about in a film because there's already a mental idea about it and it's just solidifying it. But then how much the city influences the characters would be a different question altogether. Yeah.
Charu, you're muted, Charu.
Okay. Sorry. Um. So we are here. We're at the last question now. So basically, it's a point for all the speakers, and we have to see how films are going to project cities in the future, which are under high surveillance, with the CCTVs and everything. So where protests are monitored, facial recognition technologies are being deployed. So even at traffic signals and everything. And so they're building in new kinds of exclusions. So that's like a point that has been made here for all of us to think about. Any one of you, if you'd like to discuss on this.
I believe this has been done in the past. If I'm not wrong, 1984 novel by George Orwell and its adaptations that have happened across time have visibly shown all this already with the teleported device. Of course, with different device now it is becoming more realistic. Now it is in ground and it is getting practical and it is getting pragmatic, but it has already been defined. And I believe that will always be on the fringe, and it will, of course, technological advancements and the idea of internet and how they interact. I mean, it can all be summed up with Marshall McLuhan's essay, landmark essay, "The medium is the message." So he says that with the laying of the railway tracks, the idea of relationships also changes. The kind of family in which we live changes. So the railway track is not just about transportation, it is about a whole new construction of engagements and relationships and interactions. Similarly, with social media, the way of interactions has changed. The kind of social relationships has changed. And so on with the CCTV surveillance. And of course, with the surveillance of social media, again, these things will undergo a change. But of course, the major themes throughout literature, throughout visual media depictions, will remain more or less coherent and will perhaps proceed from a beginning to the end, and it will not become the major focus. The railways has never become the major focus, or social media has never become the major focus, or even telecommunication has never become the major focus of the film. But of course, they will be imbibed as we go on, and they will be taken in the stride by filmmakers and writers and screenwriters. But of course, they will always remain an influencing factor, but not the main.
So we're at the end of our session. Thank you for such a wonderful discussion and such wonderful insights here. And I would just like to share that we have another session, Victims and Vigilantes, after lunch at 2 p.m. So I would request everyone to join that session. And again, a big thanks for such a wonderful session today.